Alrighty, we are back. College Football Podcast number 10 in the 2020 season. Thank you all for tuning in today. I'm going to go ahead and preface this podcast with a quick and brief message here. This podcast episode is going to be almost entirely about Clemson and Notre Dame, because let's be real, that was probably the main game of the weekend, for the exception of Georgia-Florida. But that game was practically a blowout, and the score was not necessarily indicative of how that game went. Florida was by far the superior team, and got to give them credit for that. But for the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to strictly talk about Clemson and Notre Dame. I might touch on a brief picture, broad, of the context of the general landscape of college football at the very end, but the vast majority of this will be Clemson and Notre Dame. So if that does not interest you, which is perfectly fine if it doesn't. If you tune in for a different reason, I completely understand. And I'll look forward to seeing you back here next weekend when I create that podcast. But on deck for today, as I said earlier, we're going to talk about Clemson and Notre Dame. I'm going to talk to you about my quick thoughts about the game, maybe some one-liner questions, maybe rhetorical questions. Then we'll talk about a couple factors that contributed to Clemson's loss, specifically with poor clock management, some poor time management, the same thing. Poor play calling, I should say, and just overall Notre Dame's play. And then I'm going to talk about maybe some injured players that contributed to that, in addition to some sicknesses. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit at the very, very end about future projections and the controlling of one's destiny. So, with that, let's get in. I'm just going to give you some quick thoughts. Did both teams deserve to win? Yes. In my opinion, I do think both teams deserve to win. I think you could make an argument respectively for each team that they did deserve to win in their own individualized way. I'll be completely honest with you. I thought Notre Dame dominated up front, and I think anyone who watched the game realized that. Clemson got eaten alive in the trenches, and it's really disappointing. Tigers only finished up with about 30 so yards rushing, and you just can't have that in the biggest games of the year. Being able to run the football is so critical, even in a time in college football where passing is so important, and you almost have to have a dynamic quarterback to win games at the highest level. I mean, ask Georgia; they've been trying this for years, and it still hasn't worked. Running's still important, and Clemson could not get the running game going almost the entire night last night, which was disappointing. And I completely expect. What in the world? Hold on.
This is the feeling of total.
What the heck? Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to pull up the stats right now on my laptop here. I don't know what in the world was that advertisement. But so team stats, Clemson has 34 yards rushing, 439 passing yards for 473 total yards. But you have to be able to establish a run. Etienne couldn't get the run game going all night. He may have had a couple of decent runs in the second half where he maybe got 6 or 7 yards. But if 6 or 7 yards is your high for the night, it wasn't a great night running. And not to mention that Notre Dame basically ate up our entire defensive line with their great offensive line when they had the ball. That was partly due to the fact that Clemson had so many starters missing on defense. I mean, if you look at this, and obviously I know you guys probably don't follow this as closely as I do, and that's perfectly fine. This is why I make these podcasts. Clemson had the starting defensive tackle out, Tyler Davis, he's out, right? Then you have Mike Jones Jr., starting linebackers out. James Skalski, who's the quarterback of the defense at middle linebacker, he was out. Landon Sanders exits the game in the first half. He goes out. Brissy gets injured in the game. You're playing basically your second and third string linebackers. You got numerous brand new fresh faces on the defensive line, and you're eating up in the secondary with guys who may have been back but are just back just off injury and everything. I knew it was going to be a tough night on defense, but the Tigers played well. They played well enough to win, but at the end of the day, when you can't win in the trenches and you can't establish a run game, your chances of success in the game are so limited. Was Notre Dame the better team? Yes, Notre Dame was the better team that night, but I do think a Clemson fully staffed, a full team, a healthy team is by far better than Notre Dame, and I'll get back to that point here in a little bit later. And do both teams control their own destiny and will potentially and most likely meet up in Charlotte? Yes. I have a very strong feeling that both these teams are going to end up in Charlotte playing for the ACC championship game. Hopefully Clemson will be much healthier by that time in December 19th, that night, in which we should be. And I think you're going to see a different result. So let's talk about the game a little bit. Let's talk about the ins and outs. Let's talk about the beginning of it and maybe the end of it. Notre Dame obviously jumped out to a massive start. They score on the first play of scrimmage, and then Clemson really doesn't settle in, and they're all 10-0 all of a sudden, and then Clemson gets the deep ball with DJ to Cornell, which works, but really until I would say beginning of the second quarter, Clemson, it seemed like we were just not ready. It seemed like we were shell-shocked, maybe just not prepared, and that's disappointing. And the thing that was key to me was there were every time Clemson would get in the red zone, we would have to kick a field goal. And in these games, you've got to score touchdowns. 7 is way better than 3 and a lot more important than 3 in these types of matchups. And, hey, that almost plagued Notre Dame. Notre Dame had the same issue, kicking field goals instead of scoring touchdowns. But when you're on the road in a hostile environment with a true freshman quarterback and you know you're depleted on both offensive line and the defensive line, you got to get touchdowns when you get a chance. It's already hard enough to move the ball, and you're going to move that. You move the ball, go on that entire journey, exert all that energy. And if you can only come away with 3, and you know you got to put your defense back out there, you got to expect them to hold. You got to expect them to hold Notre Dame to 3. You're asking for a lot, and that eventually caught up with Clemson. And I'm not going to lie, like it didn't. That maybe even the primary source for the loss, other than the fact that we could never get the run game going the entire night. Speaking of playing well enough to win, Clemson played well enough to win in this game. They did. Truthfully, I do think that. The problem is when you're playing this good of a team, it takes more than that to win. Now, that might seem very confusing to you, and I'm sorry I'm having a tough time talking. I'm trying to clear my mind. I've been thinking about so much today, and I'm very tired. Clemson played well enough to win in the sense that we played fearless for most of the time. DJ had an amazing game. And even with our hands tied behind our back and not having all of our starters and really, just not having practically anyone to be able to go and being as thin as we are at the wide receiver and the DBs and losing those guys and all that, and to still take the number 4 team to double overtime on the road, I think you're mistaken if you think that Clemson did not play well enough to win this game. Now, you could say Notre Dame should have played better, and this game probably shouldn't have been as close as it was. You could make the argument. I would actually make the argument that Clemson lost this game more than Notre Dame won it. But that's for a different time, and way too much goes into that. But if you would like that, then maybe you could text me or call me, and we can certainly talk about that. But in these types of games, you got to play a little bit better to win. And in championship football, which is what this was a championship level game. It takes a little bit more to win. It comes down to a couple plays. And when you kick field goals instead of touchdowns, when you have a fumble that ends up in a scoop and score, when you have another fumble that lands right in their hands, and when you have a couple calls go against your way, this is what happens. It just is. And I've seen it from both sides. I've been on both sides of the equation. This is what happens. Championship games come down to a couple plays, and unfortunately, it seemed like for the vast majority of the time, Notre Dame got the bounces, which may not be their fault, maybe the ref's fault. I'm not here to tell you that Notre Dame should have gotten calls. I do think there were some blatantly missed calls, perhaps on both sides. But there were some definitely missed calls, really bad officiating, especially in where they literally reviewed every single. I swear Brian Kelly could have sneezed, and they would have had to review it for something. But that I'm not going to blame the ref for Clemson's loss. I'm really not. The main reason why Clemson lost was the inability to consistently call strong plays that were going to ensure success and work the clock and strategically placed plays to maybe exploit a weakness in Notre Dame. But we'll talk about that here in a second. This was one of the most depleted Clemson teams I've ever seen, and I've watched Clemson football practically every game except for a few since 2011 when I was 9 years old, and I'm 18 now. I'm not joking when I say this. This is seriously one of the most depleted Clemson teams I've ever seen in my life. We looked almost gassed at the very end of the game. You're playing second and third string players that don't exactly know how to play yet, are just figuring out their way in the program, and especially in a year like this where spring practice was screwed up and summer workouts were screwed up, and heck, we didn't even know if we were going to have a season until about 2 to 3 weeks before the season. So with all that, your progression that you normally make in the offseason, and even that is limited as a true freshman because you're just coming in and you're just learning the system and you're trying to meet your teammates. You're trying to learn your plays. You don't know what you're getting with that. And then to abbreviate that, make it even tougher, a lot more Zoom calls, social distancing, and all that. The progression for true freshmen this year, I've gone on record. I've been one to say this numerous times. Your true freshmen are not going to play the same way this year as they have in the past just because they didn't have nearly as much preparation time. That's how it is. So your more experienced players are going to show out like Cornell Powell did, and your younger players are not going to be quite up to speed. And that's not their fault. That's just the fact of the matter where we're at in society right now with the coronavirus. So that's what you got. This was one of the most depleted Clemson teams I've ever. I know I keep repeating myself, but this seriously was. And I truly do think a healthy Clemson team playing a healthy Notre Dame team, you get a much, much different result. And to finish up my previous point about how Clemson played well enough to win, but it takes a little bit more to win, you can't scrape the bare minimum of what you have to do and just get by to beat these teams, these good teams, especially on the road. You just can't do it. You have to play outstanding to win. I mean, this is a championship level game. This is a really tough game, and you got to play well enough to win this game against all odds if you're going to win it. And unfortunately, I think Clemson played well enough to win the game. Had a couple plays go our way, but with the couple plays not going our way, specifically a couple calls not going our way, it just wasn't going to happen. And that is unfortunate, but that's where we're at. It's championship level football, comes down to a couple plays. At the very end of the game, when we got the ball back, I about lost my mind. For those of you who weren't able to watch the end of the game, Clemson got the ball back with about 2 minutes left, or maybe it was just over 2:15 left. And the 3 plays that were called on that drive were some of the most painful, torturous, scared-like plays that I've ever seen. It almost looked like Tony Elliott, who's calling the plays, was incredibly timid. I've never seen... You have DJ Uiagalelei, who's such a great quarterback, and he's played so well the entire night. Now, he didn't play perfect, but he played more than well enough to win, and he certainly played more than well. He certainly played better than what you would think a true freshman would play like in that atmosphere. And he is not the issue, by the way, but that's a different conversation. So he's playing so well. You got ETN, who's your senior running back, but you haven't been able to get the run going basically the entire night. So you need to figure out a way to get him involved in some alternative way. Maybe it's through screen passes or jet sweeps or put him in the wide receiver. You know that, okay? And for us to get the ball and run 3 straight plays of run plays when you know those aren't going to work, and then for ETN to run out of bounds, for one, it's poor play calling, and then for the second thing, it's poor clock management by ETN. He's got to know that as a senior running back, you got to get down in bounds. If nothing else, force Notre Dame to waste one of their timeouts. Notre Dame gets the ball, they go right down the field, and they score. Tie the game, we go into overtime. That was seriously one of the that really did cost Clemson the game. At the very end, especially when you get to 3rd and 14 and you don't throw the ball and you play conservative run, but it just doesn't make sense. I was losing my mind thinking, why in the world would you be this conservative when we really hadn't been conservative the entire fourth quarter? Have been aggressive, came out, had great play calling. Now you finally got a chance to win. You need 1 first down to win, and you go ultra conservative. And that was really disappointing. I'm not going to lie. I really thought that with where Clemson's coaching staff has been, and the numerous important games that Clemson has played in over this stretch, I really would have thought the offensive coordinators and the play callers would have had a better set of plays to run during this period of time. And unfortunately, we didn't. And you give Notre Dame life against a defense who's depleted, exhausted, all that. There's not a lot of players to rotate in, and they score. So that may have been the worst thing that happened all night. But, at the end of the day, you have to give credit to Notre Dame. Notre Dame played well enough. I thought Notre Dame's ability to run was massive in the game. And these weren't even special run plays. That was the thing that was perhaps frustrating over everything, both on offense and defense, was the fact that Notre Dame was running simple draw plays and getting 7 yards, 8 yards, sometimes even 9 to 10 yards, or heck, even touchdowns off of them. And that entire night, Clemson had no response for that. It just never happened. It never seemed. Now, granted, Clemson did settle in and did play very well. I mean, held Notre Dame 59 minutes without a touchdown. There was a touchdown on the first play of the drive, or the first play of the game, and then the last play of the last drive of the game. But for 59 minutes of that game, Clemson held Notre Dame without a touchdown. And that's great adjustments and everything like that. But the entire night, Notre Dame ran the ball basically wherever they wanted to, however they wanted to, up the middle, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. And when you lose the game in the trenches like we did, it's really hard to win the game overall. I mean, trenches, the offensive line going against the defensive line and vice versa, that's key to success. It maybe that contributed to the conservative play calling at the very end of the game, but regardless, you got to give Notre Dame credit there. They were able to run the ball practically whenever they wanted. Ian Book played well, maybe very well, if you want to say that. I think DJ played better. If you look at the stats, they would tell you that story as well. I would certainly take DJ over Ian Book any day of the week, but Ian Book played very, very well. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that he's terrible, because he's not. He's a very good quarterback, and Notre Dame's a very good team. Okay, so anyone who thinks that I'm making this argument that Notre Dame isn't a very good team and Clemson just played really bad, no, that's not what I'm saying. Although Clemson did not play great, certainly not well enough to win a championship-level game, although I do think we had a chance to win this game. Notre Dame's a great team, and we're probably going to see them in Charlotte. And so that's going to bring me into my last point here. This podcast is a lot shorter than I thought it was going to be, probably because I'm just rambling at this point, and it kind of sucks. But if we look at the future schedules, Notre Dame's got to go through Wake Forest, Boston College, Syracuse, and North Carolina. All four of those games should be wins if they play like they did against Clemson. Maybe the North Carolina game gives them a scare, perhaps. But regardless, even with one loss, they're still going to go to Charlotte. And then you got to look at Clemson. We have a bye week. Then we go to Tallahassee, play Florida State, then home against Pitt, and then at Virginia Tech. Florida State is awful. Pitt is not horrible, but Pitt's offense is practically abysmal at this point, and I think Clemson may just be able to outscore them. And then Virginia Tech, who just lost to the Liberty Flames, which, man, there's a story to be told there. It's amazing what a coach who calls prostitutes on a work phone a known racist president and Jesus will do for you. Heck, it'll even win you games against Power 5 competition. I mean, look at Liberty. That's what happened. But Virginia Tech is not a great team. Clemson should win all three of those games. Notre Dame should win the remaining of their games. And we're going to see Notre Dame in Charlotte, pending that there's not a COVID cancellation, of course. You're going to see Notre Dame in Charlotte in a rematch. It's almost impossible to beat a team twice, with a much healthier Clemson team, with Lawrence especially, and a replenished defense. And I'll go out here and say this now. I think Clemson, in that case, is by far the better team. Let me make this clear. Clemson came into this game with 6 starters missing on the defense alone. 6 on the defense alone, who were either injured before that game or were banged up or left. Okay? Clemson lost a ton, not to mention the tons of Clemson players that were out during the game just got injured. And yet we still took them to double overtime in a really tough environment in a game where we had a chance to win. You can't complain about that. And we're going to get Notre Dame again, most likely in Charlotte. And the winner of that's going to go to the playoff. And the loser of that's going to be fighting for the 4th spot. Especially if Clemson's able to win the the ACC championship game, I think Notre Dame actually will have a relatively good argument to make it into the college football playoff. But we'll just have to see what happens there. But I will say, if Clemson and Notre Dame were to meet up in Charlotte, I think your score is a lot different. I think the game is completely different than what we saw on Saturday. And I think, as I said multiple times now, I think it'll go much more in favor of the Tigers. And that's not anything against Notre Dame, but for Clemson to be as depleted as we were and to go on the road with a true freshman quarterback making his second ever college start and to play as bad as we did and as many just mental stupid mistakes that we had, and to still go to double overtime and still have a chance to win and maybe should have won, I'll live with it. I'm not going to complain. I'll say that. I was not, for those of you who are wondering, I was not mad after the game. I was a little bit sad because this game is going to sting. You go to double overtime, you obviously want to win. And you see the team fight so hard for a victory. And to come up short, that stings. That really hurts. But I'm not mad because I can look at December 19th and I can see what's coming. And in Clemson, if everything goes to plan, we'll get a bye week before that. Assuming that there's no COVID cancellation or a game has to be moved, Clemson is done with the season on the 5th. There'll be a bye week going into the 12th, and then we'll get Notre Dame on the 19th, which could be huge. So Clemson's going to have a bye week coming off that to get rested up, get prepared for Notre Dame, 2 weeks to prepare, and it's going to come out guns blazing. I fully expect Clemson to come out as hard as we physically can in the next 3 games to end out the season, almost a blitzkrieg-like, if you will. And I fully expect Clemson to do the same thing against Notre Dame. Notre Dame's a very good team, don't get me wrong. They are. If I were to tell you that they weren't, I'd be lying. But I really do feel like Clemson at full strength is a far superior team than Notre Dame at full strength. And we'll just have to see how it plays out. But overall, I'm not mad about the game. Clemson played well enough to win, but in these types of games, you need to play just a little bit better, or perhaps a lot better than well enough to win these games. And it was tough. This one's going to sting, I'm not going to lie, but it will be okay. The sun's going to rise, and at the end of the day, it's only a football game. These things aren't life and death, and that's a great thing. That's why we love it. It's not life and death. It was a heck of a game. Congrats to Notre Dame. If I have any Notre Dame fans watching this or listening to this podcast, I doubt I do. But if I do, congratulations to y'all, and we will see you in Charlotte. All right, so thank y'all for listening to this podcast episode. I know it was a little rambly-ish. My brain's still kind of tired from last night and doing a couple things for economics this week. I'm still going to create these. I'll have a little bit more of a broad podcast, certainly not concentrated to one game next week. One for Clemson's not playing, and 2, because I'll be able to watch a couple more games next week, and perhaps they'll be a little bit more significant games. And we have the Masters next week, which is going to be fantastic. I cannot wait to watch some of the Masters, especially on Sunday. Sunday at the Masters is fantastic, just amazing. You look at it from a lot of angles, and we like it a lot. It was great. And so I guess I will see y'all here next week. Thank y'all again for listening to this podcast, and have a good one.